Are you really ready to continue this type of level of fighting using that type of weapons and de facto destroy the whole city, eastern city of Aleppo?
The United Nations Special Envoy for Syria pleads with Russia to halt airstrikes and warns that Aleppo could be destroyed by Christmas. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. In what was described as a moment of truth, the United Nations Security Council failed this week to pass a draft resolution demanding an immediate end to airstrikes and military flights over Aleppo. Russia vetoed the French-drafted resolution, which also called for humanitarian access throughout the country. Since the US-Russia brokered ceasefire collapsed last month, the United Nations says more than 300 people have been killed and 2 hospitals destroyed in Aleppo. France and the United States are now calling for an investigation into Syria and Russia for alleged war crimes against civilians. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Ala Ibrahim in Damascus. And Ala, what can you tell us about the latest bombing campaign, the security situation in eastern Aleppo, and how this is affecting all of Syria?
Well, the situation is, as usual in Syria, very, very complicated, especially in eastern Aleppo, which is the rebel-held part of the city of Aleppo. Aleppo used to be Syria's largest city before the war. Now, hundreds of thousands of people continue to live in the city, with almost a quarter million living in rebel areas, which is eastern Aleppo, and the rest living in government-controlled areas. According to aid workers and civil defense activists that CCTV spoke with, those aid workers are still working to salvage dead bodies and what they hope to be other survivors from the rubble from an airstrike that took place in the past 24 hours. The opposition activists are accusing the Russian Air Force of carrying out that airstrike, while the Syrian state news agency Sana said that 5 civilians were killed and 13 others were wounded when rebels carried out shelling using rockets and mortar shells against the government-controlled western parts of Aleppo. But aside from this, it seems the situation in Aleppo is going to escalate further in upcoming days.
Now, Russia has just announced talks on Syria. Those talks will take place with the United States and regional powers. It takes place on Saturday. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the Syrian government has been awfully silent regarding the developments on the political scene, especially talks between Russia and the United States and Russia and other regional players. We have to bear in mind that recently there was a meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, in which it is believed that the Syrian conflict was discussed extensively, and Syria seems to be the first topic on the agenda when talking to Russia by any regional or international player. That being said, we should also mention that the Syrian government has accused the United States of being behind the failure of talks and the coordination and the agreement with Russia. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad accused the United States in a recent interview that it wasn't dealing with transparency or honesty with Russia when it came to Syria. One of Syria's closest allies, the Lebanese Hezbollah movement, or the Lebanese Hezbollah party, according to its Secretary General Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, he accused the United States of trying to benefit from ISIL, trying to pile ISIL militants into eastern Syria in order to use them to prolong the war and justify their presence in Syria. But again, it seems that everyone in Syria, whether it is the opposition or the Syrian government, are waiting for November until the US elections take place, and they think that whoever will be sitting in the Oval Office by then will decide the future policies regarding Syria and the outcome of the war by then.
Thanks, Ala. That's CCTV's Ala Ibrahim reporting from Damascus. For more on the battle for Aleppo, let's bring in our panel of distinguished guests. Joining us from Damascus is Mohammed Ali. He's a Syrian journalist who's covered the region since 2005. Here with us in Washington, D.C. is Mohammed Ghanem. He's the Director of Government Relations and a strategist for the Syrian-American Council. From London, we're joined by Alexander Nekrasov. He's a Russian political analyst and former advisor to the Kremlin. And we're joined by David Gartenstein-Ross. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Mohammed Ali, let me start with you. We're just getting this news that the Russians have announced new talks that will take place on Saturday. The United States will be involved in those talks, as well as regional powers, as the Russians put it. What does that mean?
Well, this is definitely a very important meeting, taking into consideration that the countries that are involved in this meeting are countries that are actually supporting various sides on the ground here in Syria. For example, you have the foreign ministers of Turkey, also Iran and Saudi Arabia are said to be taking part in that meeting, along with, of course, the United States and Russia. It's really important now that those regional states that played a key role in the war on Syria take part in such international meetings, not just the United States and Russia, because at the end they are supporting groups fighting on ground here in Syria. However, we have to also point out that and clarify this to your viewers further, that this is definitely not a civil war in Syria. This is a proxy war, and those states, mainly Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which has 800 kilometers of borders with Syria, has been opening those borders for all kinds of foreign-backed militants, all kinds of terrorists coming from over 80 states to fight in Syria. Definitely, Turkey should be part of those international talks. Perhaps a solution can be reached for the Syrian crisis.
Mohammed Ghanem, the situation in Aleppo has deteriorated even further, if that is even possible. Let's listen to what the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, had to say about what is going on in Aleppo. Let's watch.
The bottom line is, in maximum 2 months, 2.5 months, the city of eastern Aleppo, at this rate, may be totally destroyed. We're talking about old city in particular. And thousands of Syrian civilians, not terrorists, will be killed, and many of them wounded, and thousands of them may try to become refugees in order to escape from this. 275,000.
So, Mohammed, a very dire situation being described there by the Special Envoy. What are you hearing about the situation in Aleppo, firstly, and secondly, what do you make of these talks?
So the Assad regime is pursuing a campaign to pretty much exterminate all forms of civilian life in eastern Aleppo. Just before walking into the studio, I got news about Russian and regime planes bombing vegetable market, actually one of the largest markets in eastern Aleppo, at a time when the market was very busy. They're going after hospitals. They're definitely going after civilians. They're going after hospitals. They're using bunker busters. And when you use bunker busters, that pretty much shows you're not really going after terrorists. You're not really going after extremists. You're going after civilians, because civilians, especially in the midst of this unprecedented onslaught on Aleppo with use of cluster munitions, phosphorus bombs, barrel bombs, they're going to definitely try to take shelter in places they think they could protect them. And the Russians now are using bunker busters going after them. They're also going after hospitals. We know from the Syrian American Medical Society, a group of Syrian American doctors that operate hospitals inside Syria, that most of their hospitals in Aleppo have been destroyed recently. There are only about 25 doctors left in Aleppo, and but all of the remaining hospitals are operating at capacity. The talks, I really wish I could say that I have high hopes for the talks. I don't think so. I think Russia is interested in buying more time. They know that other countries pretty much called their bluff and found out or exposed that they're not really interested in peace in Syria, at least not the way that Syrians envision peace in Syria. So would like to buy more time because they know that other countries are considering options now.
Okay, let me go to Alexander to find out what the Russians are doing. Alexander, Russia is deeply involved in the fighting in Syria on the side of Bashar al-Assad. What do you make of this latest? I mean, on the one hand, the fighting is intensified, the bombing is intensified. On the other, there's now an announcement of talks. Explain that to us.
Well, first of all, the picture that we are being presented about Aleppo is usually one-sided, and things are said which make no sense. For example, why should the Russian and the Syrian army would destroy civilians? There is no point in that. Yet it is being said over and over again. We are also told all the time what is going on in eastern Aleppo. We are never told that the western Aleppo is being shelled regularly, practically daily, by the so-called moderate rebels and terrorists. People are dying in all of the city. But we are always told only about eastern part, as if the war is going on only there. And that, that whole picture tells me and tells other people as well that we are being lied to constantly, regularly, on a daily basis. We've seen it in Iraq, we've seen it in Libya, we are seeing it now in Yemen, and these people think that we will fall for this again in Syria. This won't work. Secondly, the talks. Well, you have to talk, because the United Nations has failed dramatically to resolve the crisis in Syria and help, start some sort of a process that might take us out of this war. So, of course, the countries involved, the more the merrier, by the way, it's only left to them now to try to work out a deal.
Right. David, what do you make of what the Russians are doing right here? That's one part. Secondly, Mohammed in Damascus told us that this is a proxy war.
It's both a proxy war and also a civil war. I mean, the proxy war element is very clear. We can see, in particular, Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar have heavily funded the rebels. And on the Syrian regime side, you've had Iran and Russia both heavily backing the regime. A lot of it speaks to broader geopolitical conflicts within the region. But it's also a civil war. About 500,000, 500,000 people have died, and I think Mohammed Ghanem does a very good job of painting the picture of just how dire the situation is in Aleppo. This is a regime that has absolutely lost the backing of its population. But this is a war in which there are very few clean hands. I agree entirely with what Mohammed Ghanem has said about the humanitarian consequences of this conflict and the way it's being pursued by the Assad regime and also by Russia. On the other hand, Alexander and Muhammad Ali point to the presence of jihadists within the opposition, and that's correct as well as of 2016. It's a conflict where, sadly, I see very little in terms of a resolution that we would be happy with.
Right. The thing is that the U.S. position has been Assad must go. And replaced with whom? With what?
It's kind of been Assad must go, right? A couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, you had John Kerry comparing Assad to Hitler. And then, that position has changed over time, where now we're talking about how Assad should go as part of a negotiated process. It seems very clear that the U.S.'s position is no longer actually Assad must go, even if it hasn't changed that much rhetorically. But look, the U.S.'s position is incoherent. I mean, I personally, as someone who not only is an American citizen, but also talk regularly to people who are very close to the policymaking process, who are part of that process, I don't understand what we think we're trying to accomplish. Look, it's a difficult civil war. As I said, there are very few clean hands. There are multiple actors involved. But the U.S., in my view, does not have a clear vision of what it wants and how it wants to change the situation on the ground.
Okay, Mohammed, in addition to those talks that have just been announced by Russia, there are reports of another diplomatic effort. In fact, there's been a letter that's been signed by 62 countries, which is circulating in the UN Security Council. Among those countries, by the way, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, calling for new talks. What do you know about that?
Well, we know for the most important point is that the Syrian army, the Syrian government, the Syrian president has made it clear many times that the Syrian government is ready to take part in any political effort that is a serious one, an honest one for ending the unrest in the country. But however, if we look back at what the Syrian president said in his latest interview, he said that reaching a political solution, having elections across the country requires, first and foremost, to fight terrorism. I mean, you have ISIL terrorists on the ground. You have the Al-Nusra Front terrorists. It is impossible to have a genuine political process happening if you don't fight terrorism. So any kind of talk, international talk, meeting or so should be actually based first on countries together jointly fighting terrorism. For example, you should have the United States and Russia together fighting terrorism. There should be a genuine will for that. Second, if I may please speak about Aleppo. In Aleppo, the situation is not like what some Western media outlets are trying to show. As Syrian President Bashar al-Assad said recently, he said that we only hear in the Western media that the situation, the humanitarian situation is dire. We only hear about that in the Western media when the terrorists are under siege. For example, we never hear hear about the tens of casualties, tens of civilians being killed or injured due to the terrorist mortar attacks. We never hear about for example, just 2 days ago, there was a mortar that fell on a school in Daraa, in a government-held area. The students were playing in the backyard. 5 students were killed and 20 others were injured. Why don't we hear about that? So definitely the situation is not as Western media tries to show in Aleppo, and we have to point out here also that the Syrian government is not shelling hospitals as they portray. At the end of the day, this would not be good for the government itself, because it would be giving those armed groups popular support for those terrorists, so It doesn't make sense. And finally, also, if I may speak, the al-Nusra Front over there in Aleppo, all of the so-called moderate terrorist groups are fighting with the al-Nusra Front at the end of the day in eastern Aleppo.
Right, Mohammed Ghanem, is the problem here the fact that you cannot very easily identify who the moderates are, who their leaders are?
No, that's not the problem, because the question is not who the moderates are, do we have moderates or not. The question is what's happening right now. The Assad regime and Russia are going after civilians. So whether all opposition are terrorists, extremists, or they're all angels, that's not the question. There's a campaign to exterminate civilian life in eastern Aleppo. A couple of points I'd like to make. Number one, I completely agree with your guest in Moscow. What Russia is doing in Syria makes absolutely no sense, because they are aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's number one. Number two, Western Aleppo. Yes, I agree with both of your guests that there have been some loss of civilian life in Western Aleppo. Those people who were killed in Western Aleppo are Syrians. We condemn what happened. We condemn, when these things happen, we condemn them. But there is absolutely no equivalence or more equivalency between some errant fire, causing 5, 6, 7 people. Every life is precious, but there's absolutely no equivalence between that and the hundreds of people that are being slaughtered in a calculated campaign. Putin is playing by the Grozny rules.